Hang on, let me fix my hair if you guys are going to get a shot of me. I'll wait for the dinging to stop. Good evening. My name is Chrissy Kapuska. I am Deputy Corporation Counsel for the City of Peoria. 3 years ago, I had the privilege of walking the City Council through the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act. At the time, we did a policy session with the City Council in 2019. We did a series of public meetings to come to some consensus that we provided to the City Council as they were making their determinations on how they wanted to set up the city's existing ordinance. Within the last few months, the City Council has determined that they wanted to revisit that issue. So we've had another policy session, and they asked us to go back out into the community and solicit some feedback. We have a small group here in the chambers tonight, so feel free to stop me as I go along. I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. At the end, there'll be plenty of time for comments as well. If anybody would like a hard copy of the slide deck that you see up on the screen, we have them over here by Stacy Peterson. They are also available online on the city's Cannabis Resources website, which I think is a quick link if you go to the city's page. So tonight, just so you know what we're going to discuss, we're going to do a little bit of brief history on medical cannabis. We'll talk about recreational or adult use cannabis. Those terms tend to be used interchangeably these days. We'll talk about some of the policy decisions that the council made in 2019, and then some policy decisions that the council is looking to make this year. So for the benefit of those in the room and those that may be watching online, the Compassionate Use of Medical Cannabis Pilot Program Act was passed in 2013, went into effect in 2014, and it allowed Illinois residents who had qualifying conditions to register with the state in order to obtain cannabis for medical use. Now, I said the word pilot, and that was in the original program as it was adopted and went into effect in 2014. In 2019, the state took the pilot part out of that, and that is now a permanent program in Illinois. What it really allows is medical cannabis patients have to have a physician certification, and that has to come from someone with whom they have a doctor-patient relationship. Throughout Illinois, there are 52 qualifying conditions that are now eligible for someone can have in order to become eligible as a medical cannabis patient. When I started giving this speech way back in 2014 or 2015 in regards to medical cannabis, there were only, I think, 12 conditions. When we talked about it in 2019, there were 35 conditions, and today there are 52. So if you have one of those conditions, you can go to a physician who will certify that you have it. They will submit that paperwork to the state of Illinois, and you will obtain the card that I showed you on the last slide. That makes that person eligible to purchase 2.5 ounces or about 70 grams of cannabis every 14 days. Although it is not uncommon for certain conditions for that physician to ask for a waiver to provide an additional allotment to that. A couple of interesting facts about medical cannabis. I think they often use the word prescription, but it's notable that it is not a prescription. It is a physician certifying that you have one of those conditions. A physician does not write you a prescription for cannabis. Medical cannabis patients are the only ones that are allowed to home grow, and they can grow up to 5 cannabis plants. And as far as the tax rate is concerned, it's generally the same as any other qualifying drug. They're going to be exempt for the most part from local sales taxes, and they may have the 1% state tax on it. I thought it was interesting to look at, since we've had so many conditions that have been added to the list of eligible conditions for which a patient can become certified, what are those top conditions? And the overwhelming majority really fall into 5 categories. The top being chronic pain, then PTSD, migraines, osteoarthritis, and cancer. Statewide, there are over 235 applications that have been approved for medical cannabis. Interestingly enough, over 1,000 of those are actually for individuals that are under the age of 18. And when I looked at the conditions for which those that are juveniles are getting certified for, there's one that sticks out that is very much in line with what you see for adults. PTSD is the number 2 condition that you see juveniles certified for, number 1 being autism, and then number 3 being seizures. You can see that Illinois, at least as of when I checked this data a few days ago, has about 138 active patients. There are 55 medical cannabis dispensaries statewide. The 2022 retail sales by medical dispensaries, you can see that number there, were over $237 million. And since the beginning of the program, the medical sales, and keep in mind these sales are different from the recreational or adult use sales, have hit that $1 billion mark. Specific to Peoria and Peoria County, we do have a medical cannabis facility located at 3125 North University that's operated by Trinity Compassionate Care Center. In 2019, they had a little over 1,200 patients. In 2021, they had a little over 2,800 registered patients. It's about a 133% increase in patients from 2019 to 2021, but not unexpected given that the state has continued to add conditions to that list that qualify them. For Peoria County specifically, in 2021, there were about 1,500 active patients. In 2020, there were a little over 1,000 qualifying patients, and in 2019, there were a little over 800 qualifying patients. You'll notice there's a slight difference, there's a slight nuance with the language there that we went from qualifying patients to active patients. That's due in part to the fact that the state of Illinois in 2021 removed the requirement that a patient had to designate one dispensary at a time with which they could have their cannabis fulfilled. They're now able to have it filled at any of the dispensaries. That's due in part to the computer system that the state put in effect. The IntelliTrack system gives them better data and better ways to track those patients throughout the state. When you look at what the city can do to regulate medical cannabis, it's fairly limited. They're basically treated like pharmacies throughout Illinois, and when the law was passed, they said that local governments can have reasonable zoning restrictions, but they largely preempted home rule authority from regulating anything more strenuous than what was already laid out in the act. So the city of Peoria adopted some reasonable zoning regulations. Medical cannabis facilities are special uses in all of our commercial districts. They're permitted uses in industrial districts and prohibited in all other districts, including the farm districts. They're also required to have a business license. Now, some of you may be wondering why I'm talking about medical cannabis. This has somewhat been on the books for a few years. I think it's important to understand that Illinois' adult use or recreational use licensing scheme really drew on what was already in place for medical cannabis. So anybody that was already in place, for the most part, as a medical cannabis dispensary, sort of had a first right to open up as a recreational facility. Those facilities were also given the ability to open up a second location near where they were already operating. So when we think about how our dispensaries end up locating, it's important to know that that's really where it comes from. Why I'm talking about it a little bit tonight. But we'll move on to the topic that I think has received a lot of attention in the last few years. As of January 1st of 2020, the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act really legalized recreational consumption, possession, and sale of cannabis products in Illinois. Well, what does that mean? It means that adults over the age of 21 can possess cannabis for recreational use, but it's subject to the following limits. And you'll see that for a resident, you can have 30 grams of cannabis, you can have 5 grams of concentrate, and 500 milligrams of an infused product, or THC. And those limits are cumulative, they're not mutually exclusive to the other. Now, I do want you to take note of the fact that non-residents can have and possess half of what residents have. And that will be, it's just an interesting fact, and you'll see it later in the slide when we look at where the sales are coming from. Keep in mind that non-residents of Illinois can only buy half of what an Illinois resident can. We get asked this question quite a bit in the legal department. Where can somebody use recreational cannabis? Well, in your private residence, although there's no home delivery, Uber Eats can't deliver your cannabis to you. And it can be consumed on site at a business if the local municipality has authorized it. And I'll touch on this a bit later, but the city of Peoria has not at this point authorized that. The list of where it's prohibited is much longer than the list of where it can be used. Where it's prohibited: public places, motor vehicles, school grounds, near someone under the age of 21, near an on-duty school bus driver, police officer, or firefighter, and then any business or landlord can prohibit it on their private property. I did say it was illegal to use it in a motor vehicle. It is not illegal to necessarily possess it in a motor vehicle as long as it's in a sealed and tamper-proof container. Keep in mind, it is still a controlled substance and illegal on a federal level, so federal properties would also have a prohibited use. We've spent some time recently talking to the City Council about how many cannabis dispensaries there are and how many cannabis dispensaries, could be coming online. And I will tell you, this is the map that the state of Illinois put out in 2019, or it may have been early 2020, that told us how many dispensaries could come online in 2020. Now, fun fact about this, the state miscounted because it was supposed to be broken down by state police district, and one of those state police districts is actually the Illinois Tollway Authority. So somebody forgot to double check that there wasn't going to be a dispensary located on the tollway. So this was the 2020 map, and if you add it all up, it says about 75. I think it should come up to 75. The numbers get a little fuzzy after that, to be honest, because of how licenses have rolled out. So in fiscal year 2020, the state actually issued about 58 dispensary licenses, and then 17 have been issued in addition to that. That gets you to about 75. The number on any given day can change, though, as some businesses close, new businesses open, ownership changes. They can put in requests to have different sites, or perhaps they want to move a license to a different site. But generally, 75 is that max we're working with. Now, in 2020, when these licenses were issued, there was also a lot of discussion about what a social equity applicant or social equity licenses would look like. And there was to be a pool and a lottery of additional licenses that were going to go out. Some of them were approved, or the pool was started, but then litigation ensued. Then the next summer, they were going to roll them out. Litigation again ensued. And then over in 2021, the governor said that, he was going to make sure that they issued the 75 original licenses plus the additional, he said 110 new licenses. Litigation again ensued. These cases kind of bounced around the court for a couple of years. But recently, in the past few months, the additional social equity applicants, and I think there are about 110 now, they rolled them out in a few batches, have been issued. Statewide, if you look at the numbers for what sales have been, it is rather staggering. So in fiscal year 2020, and keep in mind that these are the state of Illinois fiscal years, so they run from July through June of the following year, it was about $406 million. By fiscal year 2022, recreational cannabis sales hit the $1.5 billion mark. Keep in mind, that's in addition for fiscal year 2022. I also told you that there was $237 million in medical cannabis sales. So if you add all that up, you're at $1.7-ish billion. Now, earlier I said, keep in mind that non-resident individuals can only purchase half of what an Illinois resident can. But you'll see that if you look at who is purchasing products in Illinois, and we had numbers for 2020 and 2021, about 25% one year and 30%, so we averaged it out to 28% of our overall sales have really come from out-of-state residents, Not necessarily a surprise because Kentucky, Wisconsin, and Indiana do not allow use in their states. Iowa and Missouri do allow medical use, but I don't believe that they've authorized anything for recreational or adult use at this point. We have 21 licensed cultivation centers in Illinois. I think we started out with about 11. Important fact to know is that cannabis that is grown and sold in Illinois has to stay in Illinois. So all the dispensaries have to source from one of the within Illinois cultivation centers. When you drill into the state numbers, not necessarily surprised to find out that the top 3 product types would be number 1, usable marijuana, number 2, extract for inhalation, and number 3, infused edibles. So if we look at recreational cannabis specific to Peoria, we have 2 locations. We have Trinity Compassionate Care Center, and they operate at 2301 West Glen and 3125 North University. And we'll do your best. I'm going to do my best to walk through what additional licenses could potentially come online in the city of Peoria. It's really a 3-pronged process and not necessarily linear, but in order to open a cannabis dispensary, a company needs 3 things. They need a state license, they need a proper zoning permit from the city of Peoria, and they also need a city of Peoria business license. So in January of 2021, New Med East Peoria went through the special use permit process, that's our zoning process, and they obtained a special use permit to operate at 5001 North University. That zoning permit had a very short shelf life and only existed for 90 days, and at no point in that 90 days did they ask for a City of Peoria business license. They did have a state license, however. The next one, 2018 DT South Beloit LLC, came to the city in February of 2022 and asked to go through the zoning process for the property at 4600 Brandywine. They did obtain the proper zoning permit for that property. To our knowledge, however, they do not have a state of Illinois license, and they have not shown us one or associated with a company that would have allowed them to then apply for a City of Peoria license. You can see that that zoning permit for them will expire in February of 24. Blue Apple Property is associated with another company called World of Weed, and they went through the zoning process for 3929 West War Memorial. That was just recently approved by the City Council in September of 2022. They do have a state license, and we have not received their City of Peoria business license application yet, but we have had conversations with the developer and do anticipate that we would receive that. Then there's also Cardinal Ventures LLC. They applied before the Planning and Zoning Commission for the proper zoning permit at 7628 North Route 91. That should have been heard by the City Council a couple of weeks ago, but pending this discussion and pending some other policy sessions and discussions on cannabis, they have deferred that until the end of November. So I'm going to ask anybody in the audience if they have questions about those. It is expired, and that's why you see the line struck through it, that that special use had a 90-day shelf life and specifically said it would expire after 90 days. So that location at 5001 North University, if a cannabis dispensary wanted to locate there, they would have to go through the zoning process again in order to obtain approval to locate at that site. That would require both the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council's approval, yes. There is a little bit of an orphan hanging out there in 2018 DT South Beloit LLC, and that is 4600 Brandywine. That special use permit is valid until February of 24, and they are not on the list of state license holders. However, that does not mean that they couldn't associate with somebody that has been given one of the recent conditional licenses from the state, and there is a possibility that somebody could locate there. Thanks, Chris. Yes. It is. So there are perhaps some communities that would have just allowed them by right in any community, and they wouldn't necessarily have had to go through a zoning process. From my review, though, I do think it's more common that a lot of communities are requiring a special use permit just in case there's something unique maybe about that property that's not a right fit, or there's some additional restrictions that need to be placed on it. But that is a local requirement, yes. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? You know, I have a slide on that for a comparison, but I will tell you that most of our bars or package stores are permitted uses in industrial, commercial, and farm districts, whereas cannabis is permitted in industrial, special use in commercial, but then prohibited in the farm district. So there is a bit of a difference, but great question. I'll try to resolve that with the slide too. Nope, not a problem. Yes. Yes. 2-year would be our standard period for a special use permit. That within that 2-year period, if a business isn't up and operating, then if somebody wanted to operate the exact same business, they would have to come in and go through the process again. The one that expired for 5001 North University, I believe the developer and the city council, I can't remember exactly how they came up with the 90 days, but that was a specific requirement for that one. That is one of the things that the city council is looking at whether or not we need to shorten that special use period, maybe from 2 years to 1 year, or even maybe from 1 year to 6 months, so that we don't sort of have these orphan projects hanging out there. Did you have a question?
Is there a limited number of special use permits?
At this point, there is not. Great questions. So looking at some of the things the City Council did decide in 2019, they did determine that they were going to allow recreational cannabis. If you live here in the city of Peoria, you'll know that some of the communities outside of Peoria didn't necessarily make that same decision. We added some reasonable zoning restrictions. We'll walk through those in just a moment. The City Council did not address on-site consumption, and I'll explain a little bit about that here in a minute. They did determine to impose a tax, and they did determine that they were going to require a business license. So as far as allowing recreational cannabis, in October of 2019, they determined that all of the cannabis businesses could operate within the city of Peoria, and that included craft growers, cultivation centers, dispensaries, infusers, and processors, although to date we've only ever received special use permits or business applications for dispensaries. When they looked at reasonable zoning restrictions, they put in a minimum distance limitation of 500 feet between a child care facility, a school, an area of youth recreation, and churches. They determined they were going to be permitted in industrial districts, special uses in all commercial districts, and then prohibited in all other districts, and that would include farm districts. The warehouse district, for example, is a farm district. And in response to the question, there's a slide up here that sort of shows the zoning restrictions comparing cannabis, tobacco, and alcohol. And you will see that alcohol and tobacco are permitted in all of our zoning districts. The distances to school for alcohol is 100 feet. The distance from a tobacco retailer to a church or a school is 350 feet. And for cannabis, it's 500 feet between a cannabis retailer, cannabis dispensary, and a church or a school. And then again, you can see what is permitted, prohibited, and a special use. Great question. If someone were attempting to operate a cannabis business in an area of the city of Peoria that is zoned industrial, it would not, at least as the ordinance exists today, require a special use permit. So you would not have to go through the planning and zoning process in order to have proper siting. One of the issues the council intentionally did not authorize or address in the ordinance that was adopted in 2019 is whether or not they were going to allow on-site consumption. Part of that was it was a really new concept, and lounges in Colorado and Las Vegas and San Francisco were just starting to open up. So we were watching what was happening in other states that was perhaps a few years ahead of us in the industry. It was uncertain how any type of insurance would work. We know that for our alcohol retailers, they can obtain dram shop insurance. At the time, we weren't entirely sure if there would be a comparable product for cannabis consumption businesses. And most importantly, we couldn't figure out a path around or through Illinois' smoke-free law that generally prohibits smoking in indoor facilities. Now, the city adopted its ordinance in October of 2019, and then shortly thereafter, in December of 2019, the state of Illinois actually went back and amended Smoke-Free Illinois to allow this exact scenario. And it allows on-site consumption with a few restrictions. One, it has to be authorized by the local government. The business has to maintain a specially designated area for cannabis consumption. That area has to be limited to those that are 21 or older, and there has to be a locked door, I'm assuming, so no one under 21 can wander into that area. There's also some pending legislation that would allow the city to issue temporary event licenses for cannabis clubs, or even to have some sort of tourism event, maybe a tour of various dispensaries. But I'll say that bill was filed in January of 21, and I think it's been sitting in the Rules Committee since February of 2022 and doesn't seem to be really going anywhere. If anyone wants to look that up, it's House Bill 144. This is the slide that always gets the most attention, and it's how is it taxed? City Council did make a decision to tax this. This is just a sample. This is a hypothetical. Part of the tax scale slides, depending on how much THC is in a product. But if you had a product that you were purchasing $100 worth and the THC of that product was over 35%, you could assume there was a $100 purchase price. You can see how the state taxes and this county tax and the city tax then all break down, that $100 purchase, you end up walking out the door having spent about $140. The revenue that the city receives from our cannabis businesses go into the city's general fund. The state of Illinois has a very specific breakout of how they use their funds. 35% of the state revenue goes into their general revenue fund. 25% goes into their R3 program, which does grants and education. 20% of it goes to the Department of Human Services for abuse and prevention. 10% goes into budget stabilization. 8% goes into LGDF, and then 2% goes into a public education campaign. I believe there's also some provisions that they pay for all the product or all the programming cost off the top as well. One of the other decisions that was made in 2019 is that the city was going to require a business license. You can see that understanding that the industry was going to ramp up, that we put a 3-year scale in there for first year, second year, and then 3 years and more. So you can see where the dispensary licenses are. I will tell you that the license that they obtain from the city is substantially cheaper than the license they have to get from the state. Those are extremely expensive, but they are substantially more than what we charge for other businesses. So if you compare it to liquor, for example, if you own a packaged liquor store, your annual liquor license is about $3,000, and then we have a whole host of liquor licenses. So our most expensive is a package store at about $3,000, and I think our most inexpensive liquor license is for some temporary events in the Riverfront Entertainment District, and it's as inexpensive as $150. A tobacco license is $500 flat fee, and that runs annually. Sure. The cost, that's a really good question, and I don't have that information, but let us do some research, and when we report this back to the City Council, we'll try to include that next Tuesday. I don't know how many communities we'll be able to gather up before then, but that's a great question. I know compared to the state license, that we're looking at $50,000 or $60,000 for a state license, and that may run over a 2-year period depending on what you're doing. But it's a great question, and we'll look into that. And if you want to provide me your email later, we'll make sure we get that to you directly. I think one of the issues that perhaps you've been hearing in the news lately has to do with license holders and applicants that fall under this social equity category. And when the state wrote this law, the goal was to help create some minority business ownership in this adult use cannabis market. And so to do that, they set out these social equity applicants and social equity licenses. And what it said was at least 51% of the business can be, if you're owned and controlled by somebody who, and it gives these criteria, has lived in a disproportionately impacted area in 5 of the last 10 years, has been arrested for, convicted of, or adjudicated delinquent for cannabis-related offenses eligible for expungement. That definition also includes somebody whose parent, child, or spouse falls within that. Or you're a business owner with more than 10 full-time employees, and more than half of those reside in a disproportionately impacted area, or has been arrested for, convicted of, or adjudicated delinquent for cannabis-related offenses that were eligible for expungement. Now, if you look at the City of Peoria map, and that may appear better on the state website than it does on this slide, you can see that just about everything from War Memorial Drive all the way down to Bartonville is included in our disproportionately impacted area. So what does that really mean if somebody is a social equity applicant? At the state level, it means that they have a lower application fee or a license. They can get some technical assistance, and there are certain grants and loans that are available through the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, and they are not subject to the state requirement that an applicant for a cannabis dispensary cannot locate within 1,500 feet of an existing cannabis dispensary. Now, there's been some interesting guidance issued just within the last, 90 days, because what if we have 2 social equity applicants that are both trying to site next to each other? Which one is going to be considered pre-existing? And the state sort of said, neither one. You should probably let them both go there if they want to. The state fully admitted they weren't quite prepared to handle that many licenses being issued at once. The reason we're talking about the licenses is because the 110 licenses that have rolled out in the last 90 days were social equity applicants, social equity licenses. And you can see that there were 7 licenses that were granted to the Peoria BLS region. So for those listening at home, I want to be specific. The Peoria BLS region is not just the city of Peoria and not just Peoria County. It includes Peoria County, Tazewell County, Woodford County, Marshall County, and Stark County. So all 7 of the businesses listed on this slide would have the ability to locate within any of those counties. However, as I mentioned earlier, you can see that Northern Cardinal Ventures, LLC, does have a special use permit pending before the City Council that will be heard at the end of the month. And you can also see that World of Weed has a special use permit that has been fully approved by the City Council. So, some of the policy decisions and the policy discussions that we've been having with the City Council in the last few months as we've seen additional licenses start to roll out is, does the community want to see the City Council prohibit or limit recreational cannabis? That could mean limiting the number of licenses, putting a moratorium on the number of licenses. It could mean prohibiting them from congregating perhaps in one district and wanting to see them spread out through the city. So that's the type of feedback that we're really trying to hope we get from the community. The second issue is really, do we want to see the city add any additional zoning or distance limitations? So as I think was asked earlier about the special use permit, one issue that was already suggested by one of our city council members was making those special use permits not sit out there for a 2-year period. Maybe 3 months is too short. but 2 years seems too long. So maybe we strike a better balance and limit them to a 1-year period, to a 6-month period. We do know that for the conditional licenses that were just issued, they have about 180 days in order to locate a site and really have their storefront open in order for their conditional license to be fully licensed by the state of Illinois. So we think that there may be a better balance there. Are there any additional distance limitations that we want to see? Is 500 feet too much? Is 500 feet too little when we compare it to some of the other distance restrictions we have? The City Council wants to know, how does the community really feel about on-site consumption? Do we want to see on-site consumption allowed within our dispensaries? And then I think lastly, the City Council is looking for some direction and some community feedback on whether or not you want to see them incorporate some of the state statute provisions on social equity applicants. Do we want to see the City Council grant something similar that the state statute does as far as a discounted license? Do we want to see them offer some sort of grant or loan program? Do we want to allow them to operate within 1,500 feet of each other? Do we want to allow, or do we want to add, additional distance limitations? So we're looking for feedback on how we can, work with the City Council or how they can work with the community to really address that issue. And then lastly, the city's had a survey out there. I hope all of you have had the opportunity to participate in it. There is a link that is posted on the slide. The survey will close November 10th, and as of this afternoon, we've actually had about 400 responses to it. We haven't had the opportunity to go through all those responses yet, but we're happy to see that at least 400 people have taken the time to really provide feedback to the council. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions, or if anybody wants to step up to the microphone and sort of give, testimony or an opinion that we can report back to the City Council, that would be great.
Hey, thank you so much for that presentation. It was awesome, so I really appreciate that. I was hoping that the City Council would be here to actually hear the statements, but they're not. So I actually prepared a statement. I'm better at writing than I am at speaking because I'm not really a politician. But my name's Donnie Henry at 316 Southwest Washington Street in Peoria. For transparency, I'm the chairman of the Libertarian Party of Peoria County, and I'm also a commissioner on the Racial Justice and Equity Commission here in Peoria County. I'm not a cannabis user. I've been in the military since I was 18, so that really hasn't been an option. And I know what you guys are probably thinking. Here is a libertarian talking about drugs again, right? But for libertarians, this has never been about cannabis or drugs. This is solely about individual rights and freedom. In a free society, we have the liberty to live the way we see fit as long as what we do doesn't affect the right of another to do the same. Or at least that's what the founders believed. Cannabis is a plant. Any adult who uses cannabis is a willing user. Any adult selling cannabis is acting in a voluntary transaction between two individuals. There is no victim, so there's no crime. Our war on drugs in this country at its best has been a fool's errand, and at its worst has been a vicious crime by government against its people. We locked people in cages that never hurt anyone. We destroyed our poorest communities through tough on crime initiatives, and we were so heartless that we turned addicts into criminals. One day, future generations will look back with disbelief on the immorality of it all. It was a huge step in the right direction that the state of Illinois has legalized cannabis for recreational use. The law is sloppy, and the state government's greed and a lack of a basic understanding of economics has created a point of diminishing returns. In other words, taxation has been so excessive that it is either a barrier for consumers to enter the marketplace or to preserve the underground black market. Most of the people that I know who use cannabis still buy it from the same people that they bought it from 10 years ago. So that really isn't relevant here today, but it highlights the untapped potential that we could have if we limited the taxation on it. Cannabis will be a $25 billion industry. Forbes has said $40 billion by 2025, and it's created about 500,000 jobs in America. Keep in mind that this is only with half of Americans have ever tried cannabis. And so Illinois and Michigan are the only two states in the Midwest that have legalized it recreational. I think that creates a huge opportunity for us. Whether we want to admit it or not, Peoria is a slowly dying town in a slowly dying state. We're drowning in pension debt. We have failing schools. Crime is out of control. Our roads have craters in them. Businesses are barely keeping afloat. Our downtown is dead most Friday and Saturday nights. And there's homeless people literally defecating on the sidewalks. We have all of these issues, and when one of the fastest growing industries comes to our door, we want to say, get lost? Are we out of our damn minds? We should be embracing cannabis. We should be welcoming the industry no different than Bloomington Normal welcomed Rivian. We should be highlighting the possibility of the hospitality industry to bring folks to our beautiful river city, to stay in our hotels, eat in our restaurants, and catch music at our bars, and yes, our dispensaries. Instead, we are having what has got to be the most Peoria meeting I have ever heard of. Gee, should we create more barriers to the industry? Of course not. So should be no cap on dispensaries. Government has no role in this. The market will dictate whether the entrepreneur made the right decision and whether there's enough demand to sustain their business. The business should be treated no different than alcohol. I appreciate all the info today about that. This isn't rocket science. Apply the rules the same as alcohol. That's what it should be. Of course, we should allow on-site consumption. Anyone saying otherwise, I would expect their next trick to be to ban alcohol at bars or to end wine tastings at wineries or brewery tastings at breweries. We should make cannabis industry play in Peoria. As a member of the Racial Justice and Equity Commission, I believe we have an obligation to make good on what our war on drugs has done to the most vulnerable in our community. But creating more barriers to entry for entrepreneurs is not how we accomplish that. But let's simply incentivize hiring from certain zip codes within the city and grant property tax credits for businesses that choose to set up shop in those communities. Let's not say if you're going to operate, you need to do this or this or this. In closing, we have got to stop being our own worst enemy. Peoria has to adapt to be a business-friendly city, or we will die. The cards are already stacked against us. The whiskey city can become the green city, the peaceful city, the friendly city. But we just can't be the anti-industry city we have been for decades. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you for that feedback. Is there anybody else that would like to step up and give testimony or comments that we can report back to the City Council? Well, with that, I have nothing further. So thank you all very much for attending. We appreciate it. You can look for this report back to the City Council on next Tuesday evening on the 8th. Thank you. November 8th. Oh, yes, and if anybody would like to hear round 2 of this presentation,